A thin line of dread stretched across the sky. On June 27, 1976, Air France Flight 139, a silver tube carrying souls from Tel Aviv to Paris. It made a scheduled stop in Athens. Passengers reboarded, unsuspecting. Minutes after takeoff, the cockpit door burst open. 4 figures stood there. 2 were members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The other 2 were German radicals. They were armed. They were in control. The normal flight had ended. A new, terrifying journey had just begun. The captain was ordered to change course. He had no choice. The hijackers were professionals. They were cold and efficient. They moved through the cabin with a practiced menace. Passengers were told to stay calm. They were told to hand over their passports. The plane, a lumbering Airbus A300, began a long, strange diversion south. It first landed in Benghazi, Libya, for refueling. A single female hostage was released, feigning a miscarriage. For the others, the situation grew more desperate. The air inside the cabin grew thick with fear. The world outside knew a plane was missing, but they did not know where it was going. The destination was a secret held by the captors. The plane finally landed at Entebbe Airport in Uganda. The doors opened to the humid African night. The hostages were herded off the aircraft. They were forced into the old, disused terminal building. The place was decrepit. It smelled of damp and decay. Here, the hijackers' plan became brutally clear. They separated the passengers, Israeli citizens. Those with Jewish-sounding names were moved into a separate room. The non-Jewish passengers were told they would be released. The selection was a chilling echo of a darker time in history. It was a deliberate act of psychological torture. The news hit Israel like a physical blow. A government was faced with an impossible choice: negotiate with terrorists, or risk the lives of over 100 citizens. The cabinet of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was deeply divided. Every ticking second brought the deadline closer. Some argued for diplomacy. They believed any military action was too risky. The distance was too great. The intelligence was too thin. A failed rescue would be a catastrophe. It would mean the slaughter of every single hostage. It would be a national trauma from which Israel might never recover. The pressure was immense. Others in the room argued for force. They believed that giving in to terror would only invite more of it. It would show weakness. It would make every Israeli citizen a target, anywhere in the world. Defense Minister Shimon Peres became the champion of a military option. He pushed the Israel Defense Forces to devise a plan. Any plan, no matter how audacious. The Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, began its work. Agents in Paris debriefed the released hostages. They gathered details: the layout of the terminal, the number of hijackers, the location of the Ugandan soldiers. Every small fact was a piece of a deadly puzzle. The IDF's elite Special Forces unit, Sayeret Matkal, began drawing up a rescue scenario. The plan that emerged was staggeringly bold. It was almost science fiction. 4 C-130 Hercules transport planes would fly over 2,500 miles. They would fly in complete radio silence. They would fly low over hostile territory to avoid radar detection. They would land at Entebbe in the dead of night. They would storm the terminal. They would kill the hijackers. They would free the hostages. They would refuel and fly everyone home. The mission was codenamed Operation Thunderbolt. It was a gamble on an epic scale. The plan's most ingenious detail was its deception. The commandos knew Idi Amin often traveled in a black Mercedes limousine. He was often flanked by Land Rover escorts. The IDF located an identical black Mercedes in Tel Aviv. They painted it to match Amin's vehicle. The plan was to load the car and 2 Land Rovers onto the first Hercules. The commandos would drive off the ramp and straight to the terminal. They would appear to be Amin and his personal guard. The trick might buy them the few crucial seconds needed to achieve total surprise. It was a piece of battlefield theater, and everything depended on it. Section 4. 90 Minutes of Thunder. Just before midnight, the lead Hercules touched down. Ramp lowered while the plane was still rolling. The black Mercedes drove out. The Land Rovers drove out. The convoy sped toward the terminal. The deception worked, briefly. 2 Ugandan sentries ordered the convoy to halt. They did not recognize the men in the vehicles. Yonatan Netanyahu fired a silenced pistol. Another officer also fired a silenced pistol. It was too late. An unsilenced rifle cracked off. The element of surprise was lost. The race against the clock began. Commandos leaped from their vehicles. They sprinted toward the main hall. They grabbed megaphones.
Stay down. We are Israeli soldiers.
We are Israeli soldiers.
The hostages, woken by the gunfire, dropped to the floor. The commandos knew exactly where the hijackers were. They moved with lethal precision. The firefight inside the terminal was short and brutal. It was a storm of controlled violence in a confined space. Within minutes, all 7 hijackers were dead. 3 in the main hall, 4 in other rooms. The commandos fanned out, securing the building and checking for any more threats. Outside, a second team of paratroopers engaged the Ugandan soldiers. A fierce gun battle erupted across the tarmac. The Ugandans, caught by surprise, fired back from the control tower and other buildings. The Israeli forces had to neutralize this threat. They also had a secondary mission: destroy the Ugandan Air Force MiGs on the apron. Explosive charges were placed on the jets. A series of loud blasts ripped through the night. The MiGs turned into twisted, burning metal. The commandos began moving the hostages.
To the plane.
To the plane.
People were pulled to their feet. Some were carried. They ran in a confused, terrified stream across the dark tarmac. The sound of shooting was still all around them. Tragedy struck the rescuers. A single shot from the control tower hit Yonatan Netanyahu. He fell, mortally wounded. He was the only Israeli military fatality of the raid. The commandos did not stop. They pushed the last of the hostages onto a waiting Hercules and prepared for takeoff. The entire ground operation, from landing to liftoff, had taken just 53 minutes. Section 5. The Price of Freedom. The first Hercules, carrying the rescued hostages, lifted off from Entebbe. The other planes followed soon after. They left behind a scene of chaos and destruction. As they climbed into the sky, a wave of relief washed through the cabin. They began to weep. They began to embrace. They were alive. They were free. But the mission was not over. The planes had to fly to Nairobi, Kenya for refueling. There, the wounded were treated. Yonatan Netanyahu was pronounced dead. The news of his death cast a dark shadow over the spectacular success of the mission. A great victory had come at a great cost. The return to Israel was met with national euphoria. Crowds gathered at the airport, waving flags, singing. Hostages walked down the ramp, into the arms of their loved ones. The country celebrated. It was a moment of profound unity and pride. The Entebbe raid was seen as a miracle. It was a demonstration of Israeli resolve, ingenuity, courage. The world watched in awe. A small nation had projected its power across a continent to protect its people. It sent an unmistakable message to terrorists everywhere. No Israeli was beyond the reach of the IDF. The aftermath, however, was complex. 3 hostages had been killed in the crossfire during the raid. A fourth, 75-year-old Dora Bloch, had been taken to a hospital in Kampala before the raid. After the Israelis left, she was dragged from her hospital bed and murdered on Idi Amin's orders. The raid was a success, but it was not a clean one. The loss of Yonatan Netanyahu turned him into a national hero, a symbol of sacrifice. His death was a permanent reminder that even the most brilliantly executed plans have a human price. Freedom is never truly free. The Entebbe raid became legend. It is studied in military academies worldwide as a masterclass in special operations. It solidified Israel's doctrine of refusing to negotiate with terrorists. But its legacy is more than just a military textbook case. It is a deeply human story. It is a story about a ticking clock, about impossible choices, and about the sheer audacity of hope. It proved that in the darkest of moments, when all seems lost, a small group of determined individuals can change history. The 90-minute miracle at Entebbe remains a powerful testament to the lengths a nation will go to bring its children home. The Ugandan dictator, Idi Amin, arrived. He presented himself as a mediator. He smiled for the cameras. He spoke to the hostages. He promised to help negotiate their release. But his soldiers stood guard alongside the hijackers. His support was not for the captives. It was for the captors. Amin was playing a double game. He saw a chance for publicity. He saw a chance to embarrass Israel on the world stage. The hostages were now pawns in a much larger, more dangerous political theater. Their lives depended on a deadline. The hijackers demanded the release of 53 militants. If their demands were not met, the killing would begin. On July 3rd, the Israeli cabinet met one final time. The deadline was hours away. The mood was grim. Yitzhak Rabin listened to the final details of the plan. He knew the risks: a mechanical failure, an early detection, a firefight that went wrong. Any single error would doom the mission. The commander of the operation, Brigadier General Dan Shamron, presented the raid with quiet confidence. He believed it could be done. The assault team was led by a brilliant young officer, Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu. He was the older brother of a future prime minister. He was respected by all. After immense debate, Rabin gave the order, "Go." The 4 Hercules planes were already in the air. They had taken off before the final approval was given. There was no time to waste. They flew south over the Red Sea, a dark convoy of ghosts. Inside, the commandos sat in silence. They were strapped into their seats. They checked their weapons. They went over the plan in their minds again and again. The journey would take over 7 hours. It was 7 hours of pure tension. The pilots flew with incredible skill, hugging the contours of the terrain. They navigated by starlight and instruments. They were a tiny, isolated pocket of Israel, moving silently through the African darkness. Back in Israel, a nation held its breath. The families of the hostages waited by their phones and radios. They knew nothing of the secret mission. They knew only that time was running out. In the halls of power, the military leadership gathered around a radio. They waited for a signal. They waited for any word from a world away. The silence was deafening. Every minute that passed without news was another minute of agonizing uncertainty. The fate of the hostages and of the soldiers sent to save them rested on a knife's edge. The entire country was united in a silent, desperate prayer. In Entebbe, the hostages waited in the terminal. They were exhausted and terrified. Some tried to sleep. Others whispered to each other. They had no idea that help was screaming towards them through the night sky. The hijackers grew more agitated as their deadline approached. They paced the floor, their weapons held ready. The Ugandan soldiers outside were relaxed. They believed the Israelis would never dare to attack. They were stationed at a forgotten airport in the heart of Africa. They felt safe. They felt secure. They did not hear the faint, distant drone of engines growing steadily louder. It is studied in military academies worldwide as a masterclass in special operations. It solidified Israel's doctrine of refusing to negotiate with terrorists. But its legacy is more than just a military textbook case. It is a deeply human story. It is a story about a ticking clock, about impossible choices, and about the sheer audacity of hope.